Hello, friends. My name is Brad Nelson, and I am the teaching pastor of Brick City Church here in Ocala, Florida, where it is hotter than you can possibly imagine. And I also have the privilege of serving with the organization Walking the Text in Nashville, Tennessee. Some of you may be familiar with my friend Brad Gray, who started Walking the Text. It's an organization that helps people to learn to understand the Bible in its original context so that they can learn it, love it, and live it out in their life. And over the next 3 weeks, Brad and I are going to have the privilege to walk along with you on Sundays to talk about what it means to wait well, what it means to be patient, and what to do when the wait is over. And we've all been doing a little bit of waiting lately, haven't we? I know for us here in Florida, we were able to resume services after about 3 months of not being able to meet on Sundays, and it has been a breath of fresh air to be able to gather back together. But I'm also painfully aware that for you in Michigan, things are still shut down. In fact, it could be a while before life begins to feel normal again. And so I don't know what it's been like for you, but I can tell you what it's been like for me to wait, because my wife works at a doctor's office, and so she's considered an essential worker, so she's been going to work every day. I have the ability to work from home, and what that meant is that I was the primary caregiver for our 4-year-old. Preschool was out, so preschool went with me wherever I went while I was at home. And this was not a productive day. This is the kind of thing that happens. She just wants to be where I am, strumming on this guitar, making all kinds of noise. This is another video that I took of her. She found like a pitch pipe in my guitar case, and she was inside my guitar case, I think trying to make a snow angel. And then she gets up out of the guitar case and she's blowing on this pitch pipe, and she starts ramming an exercise ball around like a little goat. I mean, it's just infuriating. And so we finally got to a point where when I needed to come into the church to do work, I just threw her a bicycle in the car and said, here, get on your bike and ride around the church while I do my work. And it worked out pretty well. But waiting is hard. Waiting is hard. Because waiting makes us feel frustrated. It makes us feel stuck. It's like it exposes all of this stuff that's in there that we're distracted from. But when we're forced to slow down and sit still, we start to become aware of our impatience, our anger, our entitlement, our fear of being still, our addiction to busyness and distraction, our need to be in control, or the anxiety when we feel that things are not exactly as we would like them to be. But here's the thing about waiting. Waiting is also deeply human. Every one of us has to learn to wait. It's part and parcel of the human experience, and you can either do it well or you can do it poorly. So what I want to talk to you about today is this idea of what it means to wait well. And in order to do that, I want to look at a text from the Gospel of Luke. And in Luke chapter 1, we meet two people, Zechariah and Elizabeth. And Luke chapter 1, verses 5 through 7 begins this way. In the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly order of Abijah. His wife was a descendant of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. Both of them were righteous before God, living blamelessly, according to all the commandments and regulations of the Lord. But they had no children because Elizabeth was barren, and both were getting on in years. Now, both were getting on in years. That phrase could be also translated, or both were aged. And we know from the Mishnah that expression, that phrase, aged, may suggest that they were over the age of 60. And this is devastating for a couple, a husband and a wife in an ancient Near Eastern culture to be childless is economically disastrous because you have no children to take care of you when you're older. But probably more crushing is that it's socially devastating. Because in the ancient world, people actually believed that barrenness was God's judgment for some kind of sin in your life. So Elizabeth not only feels the pain of not having a child, the pain of the economic hardship that puts on their lives, she feels the pain of blame and judgment. And yet the text tells us that she and Zechariah were blameless and righteous before God. So they're in their 60s. And if you think she maybe gets married as a teenager, maybe in her 20s, I mean, we're talking about 40 years of hoping for a baby and 40 years of being disappointed. I can't even begin to imagine how soul-crushing that must have been. But you've got to understand that when we read this text at the beginning of Luke's gospel, it's not just that Zechariah and Elizabeth know what it means to wait for 40 years for a baby. Because Zechariah and Elizabeth are in Judea. They're children of Israel who've been waiting for the Messiah to come and rescue and redeem his people again. And from what we know and can kind of piece together, it's been almost 400 years since a prophet came, sanctioned by God, to speak on God's behalf. It's almost like God's been silent for 400 years. So when we talk about waiting, Zechariah and Elizabeth know what it means to wait. And so do we. So if you think about, there's a couple, and in their home, there's a room to which the door always remains shut. And if you were to open this door and go into this room, you would notice the vacuum streaks on the carpet because nobody's been walking on this carpet. If you looked around, you'd notice that next to the crib was a changing table, and next to the changing table was a diaper bin that had never been used. They finished the room 3 years ago when they first got pregnant. But that was 4 pregnancies ago. And so this room in their home, it remains closed, and they walk through the house and they live around this empty room, and they've learned how to keep going and they've learned how to live around it. But what they're actually doing is waiting. They're waiting on a baby. Or maybe you know somebody who went to the doctor and something came back on a test and the doctor called and said, "Hey, we need to see you back. We saw something that we didn't like." And then there was a biopsy. And after that biopsy, this woman walks around and she's doing her best to go about her life, and she busies herself and distracts herself with cleaning the house and getting groceries and going to work and responding to text messages. And it's like she finds ways to stay busy so that she doesn't have to deal with or address what starts to happen in her when she pauses and slows down. And so she keeps going and she moves really fast. But what she's doing really is waiting. She's waiting on a phone call. She's waiting on a diagnosis. Or maybe you've seen some of the images. This image just destroys me. From George Floyd's funeral. Maybe you have heard the lament and the tears and the protest of some of our Black brothers and sisters who are soul weary of waiting for change. We know what it means to wait. I mean, to wait speaks to the deepest places within us. And what we see in Luke chapter 1 is a picture of what it means to wait well. Now, we know that Zechariah is a priest. The passage we read just a moment ago says that he's a priest in the order of Abijah. And so the priests in Israel were broke down into 24 orders, and 2 non-consecutive weeks out of the year, Zechariah's order would have been needed at the temple to serve in the temple precincts. And so during that week, Zechariah comes with all these other priests who are a part of his order. He comes to the temple in Jerusalem. And Zechariah is one of many priests within his order. So once they're there, the way they decide who gets what duty is by casting lots. And so they cast lots, and the duty falls to Zechariah to go in to the main temple structure here at the center and to go into the holy place and to burn incense on the altar of incense. And behind this is the curtain, the veil, and behind that is the Holy of Holies. And so Zechariah would have been in here and pouring incense on the altar of incense. And this would have been a rare privilege. Given the number of priests that there would have been in Zechariah's order, this would have been like a once in a lifetime duty. And so Zechariah enters the holy place. He puts the incense on the altar of incense, and there's this smoke kind of coming up before the veil, and an angel appears to him and says, "Zechariah, you are going to have a baby." And Zechariah doesn't believe him. And what the angel says to Zechariah is, "Because you didn't believe me, you will not be able to speak until the baby is born." And so Zechariah goes silent. He goes mute. We don't hear anything from him for 9 months and 8 days. But here's what is so beautiful. If you continue to read in Luke chapter 1, when the 8th day comes after Zechariah and Elizabeth's son is born, the family's gathered together and they're trying to decide, what are we going to name this baby? And some family members recommend, let's call him Zechariah. We'll name him after his father. And as Elizabeth says, no, the baby's to be called John. And the family members are confused because there's nobody in the family with that name, so they turn to Zechariah, and he motions for a writing tablet, and he writes down, his name is to be John. And as soon as he writes those words, his lips are opened, and he regains his capacity for speech. And here's what is so deeply moving and beautiful to me about what comes next. Zechariah moves from silence into song. He bursts into this song that we know as Zechariah's song, or sometimes it's called the Benedictus. And it's just this beautiful, poetic song about God's faithfulness, about God's rescue. And it's loaded with all of this imagery from the Hebrew scriptures about the Messiah who was to come. And you just get this sense that even though Zechariah has been silent for 9 months and 8 days, he hasn't been silent. There's been a lot going on in Zechariah, so that when the moment comes and his lips are opened, he just bursts right into poetry and music and song, and that movement is so deeply meaningful to me. Because there are moments in life when it seems like nothing's happening. There are moments in life where it feels like we're stuck, like we're waiting, like the path isn't clear, the wind has stopped blowing, God has stopped speaking, and we don't know what's next. And it feels so much like nothing is happening. And what I love about what happens in Zechariah, this movement from silence to song, is it essentially tells us this: don't get sucked into the lie that just because it feels like nothing's happening, that nothing is happening. Because in the silence, a song is brewing. In the nothingness, something is actually happening. Now, we know this to be true in all kinds of ways in our world. And I want to show you just a couple to kind of dial you into it. So this is a website for a friend of mine. He owns a business in Grand Rapids called Boss Design, Boss Creative. And what I love about his website and the way that he does design is when you come to his website, there's all of this blank, empty space. And it's like when you look at this website, you know exactly what you're supposed to click on. You know exactly what you're supposed to look at. You know exactly what you're supposed to do because there's not all this busy, crazy stuff going on in the margins. If you've ever visited a website that's just loaded with all of this stuff, it's confusing, it's overwhelming, it's hard to look at. But what a website like this does is it utilizes what's called white space. It's space where nothing is happening, but the nothingness is actually doing something. The nothingness is accentuating and making primary what is essential and most important. And good design does this. It uses nothingness to accomplish something really important. You see the same thing in music. Musicians will often speak about the necessary role of silence in music. Jazz musicians in particular will say that silence is not dead space. It's not empty space in song. Silence is actually a part of the music. It's giving weight to what's about to come. It's building tension with what has just passed. It's giving boundary and coherence and beauty. Silence is actually this active presence where nothing is happening, but the nothing is accomplishing something essential and important. You see the same thing in architecture. This is called negative space. And if you've ever been to Ground Zero in New York City, you see a great example of this where one of the towers used to sit there now is this. And this water runs down to this like chasm. It's like this abyss of nothingness where the water disappears and where it goes to, you don't know because you can't see. You look at it and it is a blank space of nothingness. But if you have ever stood there and looked at this, that nothingness does something powerful to you. In that nothingness, something huge and important is taking place. You see this in fermentation. If you've ever done any fermenting or pickling, you put things in a jar, but there comes a point at which you just have to put the lid on and let it be. Leave it alone. And although you're not doing anything, at the microbial level, bacteria is interacting with bacteria, and two things are becoming one, and something entirely new is being born. In the nothingness, something is happening. You see this also in agriculture. So one of the concepts that comes up in the Hebrew scriptures is this idea of the Shemitah year or the Sabbath year. And so every seventh year you were supposed to let the land lie fallow, to let the land rest. And so you would leave this land untouched. You wouldn't do anything to it. For all you knew, it remained unchanged and exactly as it was. But beneath the surface of this soil, beneath the surface of your ability to perceive, the land is actually healing itself. The soil is actually regenerating. It is becoming something. In the nothingness, something profound is happening. We see this all the time. And I tell you this, and I talk to you about Zechariah, because as you wait in the midst of this pandemic, or as you are waiting in the midst of whatever life is throwing at you, and you feel frustrated and you feel stuck, my friends, don't buy into that lie that just because it feels like nothing's happening, nothing is happening. In the nothingness, something is happening, and that something is you. That something is you. Because in the silence, a song is brewing. You are becoming the circumstance. The situation might not be changing, but my friends, if you are present to God and what God is doing, you will change. And so what I want to just invite you to, as you think about what it means to wait well in these days when we're stuck at home, when we can't gather together and worship together like we would love to, like we are used to doing, in these days when we're looking at our country that's so divided and we're waiting for unity and we're waiting for justice and we're waiting for leadership, in the midst of that waiting, I would just ask you to take the posture of Zechariah and know that just because it feels like nothing is happening, it doesn't mean nothing's happening, because in the silence, a song is brewing. So I want to invite you to 2 concrete practices this week to think about how to wait well. The first practice is just this. Can you pay attention to what the waiting is stirring up in you? Is it triggering impatience? Is it triggering anger? Is it highlighting your need to be in control? What is it laying bare? What is it revealing? What is it exposing in you? If you could just let go of that urgent, reactive need to escape this moment and get to the next one, and instead be as fully present and as ferociously present to this moment as you possibly could, and confront what is this stirring up in you, my friends, you will start to become. You will start to transform. You will start to realize, there's all this stuff in me that needs to be addressed. See, in some ways, waiting is a lot like grief. There's a big difference between suffering and grief. See, everybody suffers, but not everybody grieves. Grieving is what happens when we do business with the pain we feel. It's that experience of naming, what is this pain doing in me? It's that experience of coming to terms with the fact that we're not going to have an answer to the question why. And that the real question is, what now? Grieving is what happens when you realize the damage that was done to you, it doesn't have to define you. You can do business with it, and you can move forward in life in a new way. And that is the invitation of waiting. Will you let this change you? Will you pay attention to what it's stirring up in you and what it's exposing in you? So concrete practice number 1 for waiting well. What is this stirring up in you? What is it jostling loose in your heart? And the second way to think about waiting well is simply to change your prayer. In Habakkuk 3:19, Habakkuk the prophet quotes King David, who says, my God makes my feet like the feet of a deer and enables me to tread on the heights. And essentially what Habakkuk and what David are doing in this prayer is they're saying, okay, God, if you won't change my circumstance, if you won't change my situation, will you change me? And maybe as you are waiting right now, a slight nudge, a little shift in your prayer By all means, pray, God, change the situation, rescue us, redeem us, get us back to normal. By all means, pray that. But maybe just nudge your prayer in this direction to say, God, whatever the circumstance, change me, give me feet to walk this path. This is, I think, what it means to wait well. And I want to finish just with a story about Beethoven. Beethoven was 26 years old when he started to lose his hearing. By the time he was 46, he was completely deaf. But what's interesting about Beethoven is as he lost his hearing, and even once his hearing was completely gone, he kept composing. In fact, at the age of 46, he finally sawed the legs off his piano so that the piano sat on the floor and he could feel the vibrations of the keys in the floor. What we know about Beethoven is that in the silence of his experience of being deaf, he kept composing. He kept sitting down to the keys. And although he tried all kinds of cures, nothing changed. But guess what, my friends? He changed. He changed. And he composed some of his best music when he was deaf, from a state of complete silence, because in the nothingness, something was still happening. And what was happening was him. He was becoming, he was changing, he was being transformed. And the same is true for us. The same is true for Zechariah, that if we are willing to bring all of ourselves and be as fully present to this experience of waiting, God will meet us. God will sustain us, and we will learn that in the silence, a song is brewing. Let's pray. God, I bring myself before you and I open my heart. We bring ourselves before you and we open our hearts, those places within us that cut to the very core of who we are. And God, we hold all of our waiting up before you. We hold the impatience, the anger, the need to be in control, the anxiety, the busyness, the distraction. God, whatever it is that the waiting is stirring up in us, we hold it open before you. And yes, God, we want deliverance from these things. But more than anything, we ask that in the presence of these things, you will meet us. You'll begin to change us. You'll begin to form in us the kind of person who can be the front edge of your arriving kingdom. God, accomplish in us now, as we wait, a fermentation of the soul. Make us into the kind of people that you intended us to be. Give us what we need to wait well. We ask this in the strong, resurrected name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
To close this morning, we're going to take a few minutes and just be still before the Lord and put into practice listening to the Spirit and listening to Him in stillness and in quiet and in waiting. So I'm going to sing a little bit of the song 40, which is based on the words of Psalm 40. And interspersed throughout, I'm going to leave just a little bit of space where I'll just be playing musically. And we're going to have just a question on the screen for you to be praying through and listening to what God might be saying to you in this time. So if you know these words and you can sing along with me, I encourage you to do that. But maybe just take up a posture of prayer right now. Maybe close your eyes and just be listening to the Holy Spirit and taking this opportunity just to listen to what He is moving in your heart and what He is doing in you in this time. So let's worship. waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined and heard my cry. He brought me up out of the pit, out of the mire and clay. And I will sing a new song. I will sing a new song. Set my feet upon the rock and made my footsteps firm. Well, many will see and fear. Oh, I will sing a new song. I will sing a new song. How long to sing this song? How long to sing this song? And how long, how long, how long, how long to sing this song? Go in peace.